The Red Light Bandit Case, Man or Monster? Chapter 1. Terror in the Night. In the sprawling metropolis of São Paulo during the late 1960s, a figure emerged from the shadows who would become one of Brazil's most notorious criminals, forever changing how the nation viewed crime, justice, and the thin line between celebrity and infamy. João Acácio Pereira da Costa, who would become known as the Bandido da Luz Vermelha, Red Light Bandit, was not just a criminal, but a phenomenon that captured the imagination of a nation while terrorizing its citizens. The story began in 1967, when reports started surfacing of a mysterious criminal who operated under the cover of darkness, targeting couples in parked cars throughout São Paulo's urban landscape. What made this criminal unique was not just his method of operation, but his theatrical approach to crime that seemed to blur the lines between reality and performance art, creating a persona that was both terrifying and strangely charismatic. João Acácio was born in 1942 in the rural interior of Minas Gerais, into a family marked by poverty, dysfunction, and the kind of social marginalization that characterized much of Brazil's underclass during the mid-20th century. His early life was shaped by abandonment, abuse, and the constant struggle for survival that would later inform his criminal methodology and psychological development. The victims of his crimes were typically middle-class couples seeking privacy in their cars, often in areas known for romantic encounters. The Red Light Bandit would approach these vehicles, usually armed and wearing distinctive clothing, and would rob the occupants while often engaging in elaborate monologues that revealed a complex and disturbed personality. What made the Red Light Bandit case so compelling was not just the crimes themselves, but the way they exposed the contradictions and hypocrisies of Brazilian society. Here was a criminal who seemed to understand the power of media and public perception, who crafted his crimes, not just for financial gain, but for maximum psychological impact and public attention. The investigation that would eventually lead to his capture became one of the most intensive manhunts in Brazilian police history, involving hundreds of officers and spanning multiple states. The case would test the limits of law enforcement capabilities while raising fundamental questions about the nature of criminal behavior and social responsibility. As the crimes continued and the body count rose, the Red Light Bandit became more than just a criminal. He became a symbol of social rebellion, a folk hero to some and a monster to others, representing the complex relationship between crime, poverty, and social justice in modern Brazil. Chapter 2's The Making of an Outlaw. João Acácio. Pereira da Costa's journey from a forgotten child in rural Minas Gerais to Brazil's most wanted criminal began with the kind of childhood trauma and social neglect that creates either saints or monsters. Born into a family where poverty was not just an economic condition, but a way of life, João experienced abandonment and abuse that would fundamentally shape his understanding of human relationships and social hierarchies. His father was largely absent from his life, leaving his mother to struggle with raising multiple children in conditions of extreme deprivation. The family moved frequently, always one step ahead of creditors and landlords, creating an atmosphere of instability and insecurity that prevented João from developing normal attachments or trust in authority figures. The abuse began early and was both physical and psychological, perpetrated by family members and neighbors who saw the vulnerable child as an easy target. This systematic mistreatment taught João that violence was not only acceptable but necessary for survival, and that those in positions of power would inevitably exploit those who were weaker. By his early teens, João had begun exhibiting the antisocial behaviors that would later characterize his criminal career. He was involved in petty theft, showed little empathy for others, and displayed a fascination with violence that concerned those who knew him. However, in the context of rural poverty, these behaviors were often dismissed as normal responses to difficult circumstances. The migration to São Paulo in the 1960s represented both an opportunity and a catastrophe for João. The city offered possibilities for economic advancement that were unavailable in rural Minas Gerais, but it also presented challenges and temptations that someone with his psychological profile was ill-equipped to handle. The psychological evaluation conducted after his eventual arrest revealed a complex individual who combined high intelligence with severe personality disorders. João showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial behavior patterns, and a grandiose sense of self-importance that manifested in his elaborate criminal performances. His early crimes in São Paulo were relatively minor: petty theft, burglary, and small-scale fraud, but they served as a training ground where he developed the skills and confidence that would later make him such an effective and dangerous criminal. Each successful crime reinforced his belief that he was superior to both his victims and the law enforcement officers who pursued him. If you're following this psychological analysis of how criminals develop their methods, make sure to subscribe. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize and prevent dangerous behavior. Chapter 3. The Birth of a Legend. The transformation of João Acácio, Pereira da Costa, into the Red Light Bandit was as much a theatrical performance as it was a criminal enterprise. In 1967, as São Paulo experienced rapid growth and social change, João began developing the persona and methodology that would make him one of Brazil's most notorious criminals and, paradoxically, a folk hero to many who saw him as a symbol of rebellion against social inequality. The Red Light Bandit's modus operandi was distinctive and carefully crafted to maximize both criminal success and psychological impact. He would target couples in parked cars, typically in areas known for romantic encounters or in secluded spots where privacy was expected. His approach was theatrical and intimidating, often involving elaborate costumes and props that enhanced his menacing presence. What set the Red Light Bandit apart from ordinary criminals was his use of psychological manipulation and his apparent enjoyment of the power he wielded over his victims. He would often engage in lengthy monologues during his crimes, revealing aspects of his personality and worldview that suggested both intelligence and severe mental disturbance. The choice of victims was not random, but reflected João's understanding of social dynamics and his desire to target those he perceived as privileged or hypocritical. Middle-class couples seeking privacy in their cars represented everything that had been denied to him in his own life: financial security, social respectability, and the freedom to pursue romantic relationships without fear or shame. The robberies themselves were often accompanied by sexual assault and humiliation that went beyond simple criminal opportunism. João seemed to derive particular satisfaction from degrading his victims and forcing them to confront their own vulnerability and mortality. This sadistic element of his crimes suggested deep-seated psychological issues related to power, control, and revenge. The media coverage of the Red Light Bandit's crimes was extensive and often sensationalized, contributing to his growing notoriety and the public's fascination with his exploits. Newspapers and television programs provided detailed coverage of each new crime, inadvertently helping to build the mystique and legend that surrounded the mysterious criminal. The public reaction to the Red Light Bandit was complex and contradictory, with some viewing him as a dangerous predator who needed to be stopped at all costs, while others saw him as a Robin Hood figure who was striking back at a society that had failed its most vulnerable members. Share this investigation to help others understand how criminals use media attention and public perception to enhance their power and influence. Chapter 4. The Manhunt and Captured by 1968. The Red Light Bandit had become São Paulo's most wanted criminal, with a massive police operation dedicated to his capture consuming enormous resources and generating intense public pressure for results. The investigation, led by Detective Delegado Sergio Paranhos Fleury, represented one of the most comprehensive manhunts in Brazilian police history. The task force assembled to catch the Red Light Bandit included hundreds of officers from multiple police departments, federal investigators and specialized units trained in tracking serial offenders. The investigation employed cutting-edge forensic techniques for the time, including psychological profiling, crime scene analysis, and surveillance operations that covered vast areas of São Paulo. The challenge facing investigators was enormous, as the Red Light Bandit's crimes appeared to follow no predictable pattern in terms of location, timing, or victim selection. His ability to strike anywhere in the sprawling metropolis and then disappear without a trace suggested either extensive local knowledge or assistance from accomplices. The psychological analysis of the crimes revealed a perpetrator who was not only intelligent and organized, but also deeply familiar with police procedures and investigative techniques. The Red Light Bandit seemed to anticipate law enforcement responses and adjust his methods accordingly, suggesting possible inside knowledge of police operations. The end of the Red Light Bandit's reign of terror came on August 10, 1967, not through the elaborate police operations that had been searching for him, but through a routine traffic stop that revealed the true identity of Brazil's most wanted criminal. The arrest of João Acácio Pereira da Costa was both anticlimactic and shocking. The arrest occurred when João was stopped by police for a minor traffic violation while driving a stolen car. Initially, officers had no idea they had captured the Red Light Bandit, but João's nervous behavior and the discovery of weapons and stolen items in his vehicle led to more intensive questioning that eventually revealed his true identity. The confession that followed was both comprehensive and disturbing, as João provided detailed accounts of his crimes, while showing little remorse for the suffering he had caused his victims. His matter-of-fact tone as he described acts of violence, sexual assault, and psychological torture shocked even experienced investigators. The physical evidence linking João to the Red Light Bandit crimes was overwhelming, including weapons, personal items taken from victims, and detailed knowledge of crime scenes that had not been released to the public. His ability to provide accurate details about his crimes left no doubt about his guilt. Like and subscribe if you want to follow more investigations that reveal how serial killers are caught and the challenges law enforcement faces in protecting vulnerable populations. Chapter 5, The Trial of the Century. The trial of João Acácio Pereira da Costa began on October 15, 1969, in a São Paulo courthouse that had been transformed into a media circus due to the intense public interest in the case. The proceedings would become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Brazilian history, as the nation sought to understand how an ordinary man had become such an extraordinary criminal. Judge Márcio José de Moraes presided over the trial with the challenging task of managing proceedings involving dozens of charges and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, victims' family members, and members of the public who had followed the case since the first Red Light Bandit attacks began. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Carlos Alberto Direito, faced the task of proving João's guilt in crimes that had terrorized São Paulo for over a year. Their strategy focused on the overwhelming physical evidence and João's own detailed confessions. While emphasizing the premeditated and sadistic nature of his crimes, the evidence presented was methodical and devastating, including crime scene photographs, forensic analysis, and testimony from surviving victims who courageously faced their attacker in court. The prosecution methodically linked each crime to the defendant through physical evidence, witness testimony, and João's own admissions. The defense team, led by attorney Nelson Hungria, faced an almost impossible task given the overwhelming evidence against their client. Their strategy focused on João's troubled background and possible mental illness, arguing for reduced sentences based on diminished capacity rather than complete innocence. João's behavior during the trial was notable for his apparent lack of remorse and his continued attempts to manipulate public perception through theatrical gestures and dramatic statements. He seemed to view the trial as another opportunity to perform and maintain the notoriety that had become central to his identity. The testimony of surviving victims was particularly powerful, with several individuals providing harrowing accounts of their encounters with the Red Light Bandit. Their courage in facing their attacker in court provided compelling evidence of the trauma and suffering he had caused. The trial also featured extensive discussion of the social conditions that had shaped João's development and the failures of various institutions to intervene before his behavior escalated to such dangerous levels. This broader social analysis made the trial as much about Brazilian society as about one individual's crimes. The psychological evaluation presented during the trial revealed the depth of João's mental illness and the factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. However, the evaluation also confirmed that he understood the nature and consequences of his actions, supporting the prosecution's argument for criminal responsibility. Share this story to help others understand how the justice system handles complex cases involving mental illness and social factors. Awareness of these processes is important for public safety. Chapter 6, The Verdict and Its Aftermath. On December 18, 1969, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict in one of Brazil's most significant criminal trials. João Acácio Pereira da Costa was found guilty on all counts, including 11 murders, dozens of robberies, and multiple sexual assaults. He was sentenced to over 300 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. The verdict was met with relief and satisfaction by the victims' families and law enforcement officials, who saw it as validation of their efforts and a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated. However, the sentences could never truly compensate for the lives lost or heal the trauma inflicted on survivors and their families. The public reaction to the verdict was complex and divided, reflecting the contradictory feelings that many Brazilians had developed toward the Red Light Bandit during his criminal career. While most celebrated his conviction, others expressed sympathy for someone they viewed as a product of social inequality and institutional failure. The legal precedent set by the case was significant for Brazil's criminal justice system, establishing important principles about the prosecution of serial offenders and the use of psychological evidence in criminal trials. The case influenced subsequent legislation and court decisions regarding criminal responsibility and sentencing. Following his conviction, João was transferred to the Carandiru Penitentiary, one of Brazil's most notorious prisons, where he would spend the remainder of his life among the country's most dangerous criminals. His imprisonment marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Red Light Bandit legend. His behavior in prison was notable for his continued attempts to maintain his notoriety and influence public perception through interviews, letters, and statements released through his legal representatives. João seemed unable to accept his reduced circumstances and continued to seek the attention and recognition that had become central to his identity. The psychological evaluation conducted during his imprisonment revealed little change in his fundamental personality, disorders, or his capacity for genuine remorse. Prison psychologists noted that while he had learned to control his behavior to avoid punishment, he showed no real understanding of the harm he had caused his victims. The media's continued interest in João provided him with a platform to maintain his public profile, though the coverage gradually shifted from sensationalistic reporting to more analytical examinations of his crimes and their social context. Chapter 7, Cultural Impact and Social Legacy. The Red Light Bandit case transcended its origins as a criminal investigation to become a cultural phenomenon that reflected and influenced Brazilian society's understanding of crime, justice, and social inequality. João Acácio Pereira da Costa's transformation from a forgotten child of poverty into a notorious criminal captured the public imagination and sparked debates that continue to this day. The case inspired numerous works of popular culture, including books, films, documentaries, and academic studies that examined different aspects of the crimes and their social context. The most famous cultural representation was the 1968 film O Bandido da Luz Vermelha, The Red Light Bandit, directed by Rogério Scancerla, which used the case as inspiration for a surreal examination of crime and social alienation in modern Brazil. Academic researchers from various disciplines found the case to be a rich source of material for studying criminal behavior, social inequality, media influence, and the relationship between individual pathology and social conditions. The extensive documentation of João's crimes and background provided valuable data for understanding the factors that create violent offenders. The case also influenced journalism and media coverage of criminal cases, as reporters and editors grappled with the ethical implications of providing extensive coverage to criminals who seemed to thrive on public attention. The Red Light Bandit case became a cautionary tale about the potential for media coverage to inadvertently promote criminal behavior. Social workers and child welfare advocates used the case to highlight the importance of early intervention and support for at-risk children. João's background of poverty, abuse, and neglect provided a powerful example of how social failures can create dangerous individuals who pose threats to public safety. The case contributed to discussions about criminal justice reform, particularly regarding the treatment of mentally ill offenders and the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. João's case raised questions about whether society's response to crime should focus primarily on retribution or on addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior. The impact on law enforcement was significant, as the investigation techniques developed during the hunt for the Red Light Bandit influenced police procedures and training for decades to come. The case demonstrated the importance of psychological profiling, interagency cooperation, and community engagement in solving complex criminal cases. The victims' rights movement in Brazil was influenced by the case, as advocates worked to ensure that the focus remained on supporting survivors rather than glorifying perpetrators. The case highlighted the need for better support services for crime victims and their families, and subscribe to stay informed about how landmark criminal cases influence social policy and reform. Understanding these connections helps us work toward a safer and more just society. Chapter 8. The Question of Responsibility. The Red Light Bandit case raised fundamental questions about the nature of criminal responsibility and the factors that transform individuals from victims of social circumstances into perpetrators of violence. João Acácio Pereira da Costa's life story embodied the complex relationship between individual choice and social determinism that continues to challenge our understanding of criminal behavior. The evidence of João's traumatic childhood, marked by poverty, abuse, and neglect, provided clear documentation of the social failures that had shaped his psychological development. Mental health experts who examined him found extensive evidence of personality disorders and psychological damage that could be directly traced to his early experiences of trauma and abandonment. However, the same evidence that explained João's criminal behavior also highlighted the thousands of other individuals who had experienced similar trauma without becoming violent criminals. This paradox raised difficult questions about the relationship between social conditions and individual responsibility that the criminal justice systems struggled to address. The debate over whether João was primarily a product of his circumstances or an individual who had chosen to commit evil acts reflected broader philosophical and legal questions about free will, determinism, and moral responsibility. These questions had practical implications for how society should respond to individuals like João and what measures might prevent similar cases in the future. The case also highlighted the role of mental illness in criminal behavior and the challenges of balancing public safety with compassionate treatment of individuals whose actions may be influenced by psychological disorders. João's case became a reference point for discussions about criminal responsibility and the appropriate response to mentally ill offenders. The social reforms that followed the case, including improved child welfare services, enhanced mental health care, and better support for at-risk youth, reflected society's recognition that preventing crime required addressing its root causes, rather than simply punishing its manifestations. The ongoing debate about João's case reflected the complexity of human behavior and the difficulty of creating simple categories of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, that could adequately capture the nuanced reality of individual lives, shaped by both choice and circumstance. Educational institutions incorporated the case into their curricula, using it to teach students about the complex factors that contribute to criminal behavior and the importance of early intervention and social support in preventing violence. Chapter 9. The Final Years and Death of João Acácio. Pereira de Costa spent his final decades in prison, aging from a notorious young criminal into an elderly inmate, whose notoriety gradually faded as new crimes and criminals captured public attention. His later years were marked by declining health, continued psychological evaluation, and occasional interviews that provided glimpses into the mind of someone who had once terrorized an entire city. The question of whether João had changed during his long imprisonment remained a subject of debate among mental health professionals who continued to evaluate him. While some noted improvements in his behavior and apparent acceptance of responsibility for his crimes, others remained skeptical about whether his fundamental personality disorders could ever be truly addressed. Prison officials noted that João's intelligence and leadership abilities made him a complex figure within the correctional system. While his advanced age and long imprisonment had reduced his physical dangerousness, his psychological influence on other inmates remained a concern for prison administrators. The media's interest in João continued sporadically throughout his imprisonment, with journalists and researchers seeking to understand what had created such a notorious criminal and what lessons could be learned from his case. These interactions revealed an individual who remained articulate and intelligent, but showed limited genuine remorse for his victims. The victims of João's crimes and their families continued to deal with the long-term consequences of their traumatic experiences throughout his imprisonment. Many expressed frustration with the continued attention given to their attacker rather than focusing on supporting survivors and preventing similar crimes. João Acácio Pereira de Costa died in prison on October 5, 1998. At the age of 56, bringing to an end one of the most notorious criminal careers in Brazilian history. His death marked the conclusion of a life that had begun in poverty and obscurity, but had achieved a kind of immortality through the horror and fascination his crimes had generated. The circumstances of his death were as controversial as his life had been, with some reports suggesting suicide, while others indicated natural causes related to his deteriorating health. The uncertainty surrounding his final moments seemed fitting for someone whose entire life had been shrouded in mystery and contradiction. The news of João's death generated mixed reactions from the public, with some expressing relief that a dangerous criminal could no longer harm anyone, while others reflected on the waste of human potential and the social failures that had created such a destructive individual. Chapter 10. Legacy and lasting questions. The question of whether João Acácio Pereira da Costa was a man or a monster remained unresolved at the time of his death, as it had throughout his life and criminal career. The answer likely encompassed elements of both perspectives, as he was simultaneously a product of social circumstances and an individual who had made choices that caused immeasurable suffering. The legacy of the Red Light Bandit case continued to influence Brazilian society long after João's death, with ongoing discussions about crime prevention, social justice, and the treatment of mentally ill offenders. The case served as a permanent reminder of the complex relationship between individual pathology and social conditions in creating both victims and perpetrators of violence. The social reforms and policy changes that had been implemented in response to the case continued to evolve, with regular assessments of their effectiveness and adjustments based on new research and changing social conditions. The case's influence on criminal justice, social welfare, and child protection policies remained visible decades after João's death. The case remained a subject of academic study and popular interest, with new generations of researchers and writers finding fresh perspectives and insights in the extensive documentation of João's crimes and their social context. The Red Light Bandit case became a permanent fixture in Brazilian criminal justice history and popular culture. The question of how society should respond to individuals like João Acácio Pereira da Costa remained relevant and challenging, as new cases of serious criminal behavior continued to test the balance between public safety, individual rights, and social responsibility. The Red Light Bandit case provided both cautionary lessons and hopeful examples of society's capacity for positive change. The media's approach to covering criminal cases continued to be influenced by the lessons learned from the Red Light Bandit case, with greater awareness of the potential for sensationalistic coverage to inadvertently promote criminal behavior or harm victims and their families. The case served as a reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we would like to believe, and that protecting society requires constant vigilance against both individual pathology and the social conditions that create dangerous individuals. In the end, the question of whether João Acácio Pereira da Costa was a man or a monster may be less important than the lessons his case provides about the need for compassion, justice, and social responsibility in creating a society that protects its most vulnerable members while holding individuals accountable for their choices and actions. The Red Light Bandit case challenged Brazilians to confront uncomfortable truths about their society, while working toward a more just and safe future for all. The case demonstrated that understanding the causes of criminal behavior is essential for prevention, but that understanding should never excuse the harm caused to innocent victims. The ultimate legacy of João Acácio Pereira da Costa may be found not in the notoriety he achieved through his crimes, but in the social awareness and reforms that his case inspired, potentially preventing other troubled individuals from following a similar path of destruction and protecting countless potential victims from experiencing similar trauma. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.